Well, let's get started. Just introduce things. So welcome to this March session of the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum. I'm Gordon Karkner, one of the committee members, and help to propose these and develop these lectures and discussions. But I think before we begin the proceedings, we should just acknowledge that we are in Vancouver, especially, are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So that needs to be said. The forum, we'll call it for short, has been flourishing now for some 30 years. It's been an exciting journey, a substantial academic interchange. And I'll just mention four of the purposes of the forum: to probe some of the big questions and gain that articulate grasp of the issues. Secondly, to recover sound wisdom from the past, to connect with history. Thirdly, to promote a progressive dialogue or discourse on faith and reason, faith and culture, through dialogue and debate. And finally, as it relates to today, seeking justice and healing in society. So if you want to know about further events that are coming up in the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum, we ask you to look to our website, ubcgfcf.com. So today our speaker is well equipped to address the subject of restorative justice. Ray is a status Cree from Northern Alberta, from the Swan River Band, Treaty 8. He's been involved in numerous discussions about healing the wounds of the past. And he and his wife, Elaine, have been involved in developing support groups for victims of abuse. And he's been quite involved in this group called Indigenous Pathways. Here at UBC, Dr. Aldred is involved in the formation of future leaders in the Indigenous Studies Program at Vancouver School of Theology. He's also professor of Indigenous Theology, and as it turns out this year, he's interim dean of the whole seminary. So he's quite busy. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Reverend Dr. Raymond Aldred on the topic, can we handle the truth and take responsibility for reconciliation? So just a couple things before we start. We would ask all of you, if you've just joined us, to mute your microphone, and so that Ray has full audience. And so thank you very much. And Ray, take it away. You're still there somewhere?
Thanks so much.
There we go.
Hey, it's well, it's not exactly the way I thought it would be, but I suppose that's been the last year for everybody. And I just want to say a special shout out to my friend Neil McPherson and Heather Clark, who have helped immensely with the Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology. There's probably others here too, but I just see them on my screen and I wanted to make sure I said hello. My talk is really, it comes out of a chapter I had in a book. I think I got it published in a couple places. One was in, it was at an anti-racism sort of, there was a whole bunch of papers dealing with, trying to deal with racism in Chicago, and I presented this. And then I got it published in another place called what did I call it? What did they call it? Colonized Conversion. But the idea for the paper came out of the lens of Indigenous identity, which I found, part of studying in theology and for the seminary. In seminary, I was halfway through, like I thought it was incredibly dry and intellectual, and but at one point, halfway through doing my Master of Divinity degree, I began to read scripture and to think about things through an Indigenous lens, through the lens of my ancestors, through storytelling. And it gave new life. And sort of the lens of Indigenous identity has helped me to think about Canada and what we've been going through. And also the abuse and recovery of identity, that was part of ongoing.
Mother's on her way. Can you meet her downstairs?
The ongoing struggle of recovery of identity in Canada. We really been on a journey towards reconciliation for about at least 30 some years. Really, for me, I think you could, with Oka, the Oka crisis, and then out of that coming the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, and then I was there when Elijah Harper called for the Sacred Assembly in Gatineau and 1995, and we were seeking a spiritual solution to try to discover a way to deal with racial enmity that existed in Canada. Although at the time, I know one of the few things we could all agree that none of us liked the federal government, but that didn't seem much of a grounds for reconciliation. Also, in the year after Stephen Harper made an apology in the House of Commons, along with the other leaders of the different parliamentary parties in the House of Commons, a year later, I had a meeting, myself and some other Indigenous people had a meeting with Chuck Strahl, who then was the Minister of, it was called Indian and Northern Affairs then. And we asked him, what does non-assimilationist policy look like? Because Chuck Strahl and the government had apologized for the assimilationist policies of residential schools. So I was the chairperson of this task force for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And I asked him, because Adrian Jacobs, I'd phoned up Adrian Jacobs and said, what do you want me to ask him? And he said, ask him what non-assimilationist policy looks like. And then I added a question of my own. I asked him, so what does repentance look like for Canada? Because Chuck Strahl is a Christian man. And then the other thing that added to the paper that I did was the observation that trying to make people feel guilty, or I guess feel shame, there was a limited return to that. And I was trying to think through other ways of thinking. I thought, what about repentance as responsibility? And I actually got that idea listening to Gabor Mate, who was talking about, for an addict, the idea that you could take responsibility, and that's really what the 12 steps is about. The idea that you could take responsibility for your life and begin to work towards healing felt like another chance. And so the goal of this, my goal was to try to help people understand that we could take responsibility for the things that had happened in Canada and begin to work towards healing. I was also motivated. Now, I think I read it in a book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Papers from Prison. In it, he said, when you can stop worrying about your own innocence, perhaps then you're free to take responsibility for the sins of society and start working towards their healing. So that's kind of the ideas for this paper. And then over top of that, I was thinking about restorative justice. I was inspired by, I listened to Pierre Allard give a lecture on restorative justice. And at that time, he was the head of the chaplains in the correctional institutions in Canada. And he talked about, back in the 1990s, he was talking about that in Canada, most Canadians didn't even recognize that justice was missing. He said one of the only groups in Canada who realize that something's missing are Indigenous people. the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit recognized that justice was missing. And then he went on to talk about restorative justice. And I thought it was a great overlay of an approach to reconciliation in Canada. And there was just understanding that restorative justice was an attempt at reconciliation. And in order for a restorative justice to occur, you have to tell the truth. There's got to be complete disclosure. You have to tell the truth. That's the first movement in restorative justice. And the second is you must listen. You have to listen with your heart. Everybody involved. I remember one time I sat in a sentencing circle, which is an alternative sentencing approach in Indigenous court, and I sat in one in Regina, Saskatchewan, for a young man who had he was guilty of breaking and enter. The victims of the crime had agreed to be there, and they were in the circle. And then the young man who'd committed the offense was there. His uncle was there, and I knew his uncle. And then I was there as a member of the community. The Crown prosecutor was there. There was a social worker and a judge. And we sat in that circle, and everybody told the truth. And the people who had been the victim of this crime told him how it made them feel when what he did. And I remember, because the young man was listening, he had emotion, and you could see that it impacted them, and they expressed their emotion. In order for restorative justice to happen, you have to listen with your heart. You have to really hear. The third movement is you got to come up with a shared plan if you're going to have restorative justice. And in that sentencing circle, we came up with a plan about how to heal the damage that had been done. The people, I was proud of the people who had been robbed. I remember them saying, "We don't think that you should go to jail. That's not going to help anybody." And we talked about a plan about how we could heal the damage. I like to use that model, thinking about Canada and Indigenous people and the quest for reconciliation, because in one way, that's what we're attempting, reconciliation. And so we got to tell the truth. And really, that's what happened in Canada. The other thing I was trying to do was, I thought, I was trying to reconcile whether or not you could actually still use theology and Christian language, because it had so much baggage as a result of the residential schools, because the church was pressed into use by the government to try to re-socialize Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous children. And, I had to memorize a definition for repentance. Repentance is a contrite turning from sin. It's an essential part of the Christian Christian conversion, and an essential part of the ongoing Christian life. I memorized that in like 1988, I think, part of a theology class. But I thought, could you still use that language after all the things that have happened in the residential school? I remember we met with former Prime Minister Paul Martin in one of the rooms in the Senate in Ottawa. There was 9 of us there, all Indigenous and all Christians. And he wanted to know why we would still follow the Christian faith after all the stuff that had happened. I remember that meeting. And it's a good question. And part of my investigation, and when I wrote this paper, was to see maybe you can't use that language anymore. particularly through the residential schools and the way that Canada used that language. Because in Canada, what repenting meant, you had to repent of being Indigenous and you had to be converted to be European in the way that you dressed and the way that you talked. In fact, my grandfather forbid my mom to speak the Cree language because he said if you develop that, he believed if my mom spoke Cree, she would face a lot of discrimination in society. So he decided to try to make her like the rest of Canada and not speak any Cree and only speak English. And that's what it meant in the residential schools. They tried to convert Indigenous children into good Euro. It was called resocialization. And what they did was they attacked every significant relationship that Indigenous children had in the residential school. So they attacked their relationship with their family. One school official wrote that the adults were too stuck in their wigwam ways and they needed to be separated from their parents because their parents were too, it was sort of hopeless for them. You had to focus on the youth. That's what they believed. So their relationship with their family was attacked. They wanted to sever that relationship. In fact, in another school, they wrote that the school would become their mother. The residential school would become their mother. They also attacked the relationship that the children had with their land. People from the West Coast, Gitsagukla, which is up by Hazelton, they were sent to Edmonton to go to residential school. The idea was that if you could separate them from their land, then they would be better money-making laborers because they would have no ties to the land. And there was also a big push to get Indigenous people off the land so that people who were going to do something with the land would take it and give it value by developing it. That was the idea in Canada. So they attacked the relationship with the land. They also attacked the relationship with their spirituality. John West, who was the first missionary with the Anglican Church in Canada, he said, you need to convert the heathen and cultivate the heath. That was the job of the missionary. John West. Some of my ancestors were baptized by John West at York in the Red River settlement in Winnipeg. But they attacked the spirituality. I remember reading one church official, it's one school official, I should say, I think with the Catholic Church, said that that spirituality was just superstition, pagan superstition that needed to be replaced with Christian faith. So they attacked the spirituality. Once you attack someone's connection with the land, their connection with their people, their language, and their spirituality, well, then you've basically made them attack their humanity. And as a result of that, and many Indigenous people developed a self-contempt for their own identity. But that wasn't the only thing that happened in Canada. About the 1950s, there's also all these relocation events that happened. I got a chance to go to Churchill, Manitoba one time. If anybody's been up to Churchill, I don't know. It's quite the place to go. There's only about 20 miles of roads from, because you got to take a train or take a plane there. I remember one time they were driving us around. They were showing us around. We saw polar bears and things, but we were driving from the main community. There used to be a Canada Research Center up there, Northern Research Center. And we were driving towards there. And there's only 20 miles of roads. And maybe oh, I don't know, 8 kilometers out of Churchill, I see these houses off to the side. He said, oh, what's that over there? And they said, oh, those are cottages. And I said, oh, why would you need a cottage in Churchill? They said, well, it's nice to get out of town, they said. And I just laughed. I laughed. But then we went to see a musher. So there's a musher up there who had, oh, he must have had 40, 50 dogs, a Métis guy. So as we're driving out there, though, I see all these little foundations, just little foundations, about the foundations of these little houses about this high. And there's 1 or 2 of the houses left. And I asked a Métis fellow who was showing me around, I said, well, what's that? He said, that's the Dene village, he said. I said, the Dene village? He said, what do you mean? He said, well, in the 1950s, Canada took all the Dene, the Seesi Dene, and they made them move to Churchill. Canada was convinced that Indigenous people were the cause of the decimation of the caribou herds. And so they decided that they would move the Seesi Dene, whose territory was around Dooley Lake, that they would move them to Churchill, Manitoba. So they just loaded them up and moved them all. It was one of their relocation. It wasn't the only relocation attempt. They also moved some Inuit people. But I remember they moved these Dene people. And I said, well, what happened to their houses and things? He said, well, I think the first few years they were in Churchill, of the 300 people, something like 100 of them died. And so they decided they needed to get out of Churchill and somehow go back to their territory, or they were all going to die. Because when they were relocated, again, they were cut off from their land and their traditional way of living. And now I remember there's a book called Night Spirits by Isidore, I think. And she said, we were reduced to macaroni and food stamps. That's what we were reduced to. They had no land. And then the family relationships began to break down. There was because there was nothing to do. There was loss of roles, so people started drinking alcohol, and then there was no spirituality anymore. They really weren't welcome in Churchill, and so pretty quick, people again developed a self-hatred for who they were. As bad as racism is, the worst thing about racism is that actually you begin to believe those things about yourself. I think in Canada, there's 5 lies that damage children. I heard this from a fellow once, and I thought, I think Canada's told those same lies to Indigenous people. And 5 lies that hurt children, and that a lot of Indigenous people have embraced about who they are, at least my age have anyways, is you're no good. You're no good. And until Dances with Wolves, it was not cool to be an Indian. Always takes a white guy to make it cool to be an Indian. Something wrong with that, I think. But you know, when I was a kid, when we played Cowboys and Indians, nobody wanted to be the Indian. Even though I had 4 brothers, there was 5 of us. We're all have Indigenous ancestry. None of us wanted to be the Indigenous person in Cowboys and Indians, because Cowboys are good. Everybody wanted to be the good guy. Cowboys are good. Indians are bad. We believe that first lie. You're no good. I heard a lot of people call Indigenous people lazy. And I believed that lie about myself, that I was lazy and that I had to prove to non-Indigenous people that I wasn't lazy. It was hard to get a job as an Indigenous person because everybody said that we were lazy. Even though early encounters with the Cree people, who my people are part of, they wrote about the Cree as those guys never stop working. They work all the time, all the time. The third thing people say to kids that damages them is, you don't belong. I remember I used to go to school. There was only a couple of us Indigenous kids in the school. every day they'd make us stand up in front of the class, and we'd have to hold out our hands to see if our fingernails were clean and our hands were clean. And if they were clean, you got to sit down. But if they were dirty, you had to stand up there. And every day I was the only kid standing up there. And I thought, I'm dirty. I don't belong. I don't belong. And I believed that lie. Because my mom grew up with the same things and my grandfather, then you begin to believe that you're no good and you fight. I fought with my mom a lot. When I was 16 years old, I said to my mom, why don't you just go to hell? And she said, I may go to hell, but you'll be there waiting for me. And I remember I walked out. That's the first time I left home. I was 16 years old. And I walked out, and I remember walking out and thinking, I have become so bad that my own mother, can't stand me. And I believe that fourth lie, you're unlovable. And so lots of Indigenous people just try to fit in. My grandfather used to tell everybody he was Chinese. He even learned some Cantonese so he could pass himself off as Chinese. My mom told everybody we were mostly French and Scottish. That's how she dealt with it. And I too grew up that way. I remember though, we were at my grandmother's funeral, and my younger brother, we were in our 30s, but my younger brother leaned over and he said to me, I wonder when all the French and Scottish relatives are getting here. And because there was all Indigenous people. But you believe that lie. You don't belong. You don't belong. I remember first school I was teaching at, it was Stephen Harper. They'd passed another law that was taking away some things that were part of the treaty from Indigenous people. And I remember saying to my colleagues, I don't know if any of you know how it feels to have your government sort of passing laws against your very identity as a people. And I remember that. But there was an apology. But part of it was, the apology came because I think people started telling the truth. And I wondered if repentance would work then, you see, in the midst of that. For Indigenous people, like when you're told that you had to repent of being Indigenous, how can you keep using that word? And I thought you could, what I needed to do as an Indigenous person is I had to reconcile with who I was. Part of my healing was to embrace the Indigenous identity that I had been given, to turn from self-hatred, to turn from trying to replace my identity with something else that society told me I needed to be like, but to embrace who I was, to embrace my God-given Indigenous identity. So when it says that what we do is to try to build support for people, my wife and I, a big part of it was to help people embrace who they were as human beings. I used to meet with a Indigenous guy in Regina, and he used to teach me. He tried to teach me about what it was to be an Indigenous man. And he used to always say that Indigenous men, they won't say who they are. They won't say who they are. And because they won't embrace who they are, they can't heal. They can't heal. You need to tell the truth. That's what started to happen in Canada. What happened in Canada, sinfulness in Cree culture means to fall out of balance, means to pushed into shame. The way shame works is, shame, when you do something that's legitimately wrong, if you feel shame, it's trying to help you heal and correct the wrong that you've done. The problem with the lies that Indigenous people have believed because of what Canada has said to them is you feel this illegitimate shame. You feel shame just for being who you are. The problem with that is there's no place to go that you can find honor. Shame is supposed to be a pathway back to find honor, but it's like all you feel is shame, and there's no path back to honor, no path. And I thought, what if repentance meant taking responsibility? So for an Indigenous person, it meant to embrace the Indigenous identity that I had, to turn and embrace and confront the lies that I believed about myself, and begin to turn to heal the relationship with the land. Part of that healing meant for me to begin to heal relationship with others in my family, try to work on the dysfunction that existed because of what happened. Martin Brokenleg, Dr. Martin Brokenleg, who lives in Victoria now, he said that every Indigenous person has experienced trauma. And because of that, and because of the residential school, the only response that had for our survival, we just stopped feeling. And because of that, sometimes we lack the emotional intelligence to help our children deal with traumatic situations. That's a generational kind of thing. So part of my healing has been learning to feel. I'm your typical, I was your typical 50-year-old man. I thought the solution to hard emotions, difficult emotions, was to not feel. Thankfully, there were Indigenous women in my life who helped me to start to feel, to deal with those emotions, and to understand what was going on, to begin to heal. And part of that was healing the relationship with the land. And part of it was relationship with others, both the lateral violence that had occurred, to begin to heal that, and also the relationship with the other people in the land. So healing the treaty relationship that exists in Canada. One of the myths that exists in Canada is that settlers came and established this nation and then took pity on Indigenous people. John A. Macdonald said, Indigenous people sort of exist because of the goodwill of Canadians, and beggars should not be choosers. But that's exactly wrong. Well, John A. Macdonald got lots of things exactly wrong. That's why they got his statue in Time Out there in Victoria, I think. Although, sort of, I always thought it was funny that a city whose paper is called The Colonist would be up in arms about a statue of Johnny Macdonald. It sort of fits, doesn't it? Anyways, Johnny Macdonald had it exactly wrong. Canada exists because of the goodwill of Indigenous people, because Indigenous people understood about treaty and they made treaty. That's why Canada exists. Canada is a treaty nation. Another thing a lot of Canadians don't understand is that we're all treaty people. We're all treaty people. Canada exists because of treaty. And so begin to heal the treaty relationship with others. Got to tell the truth. You got to listen. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was really set up by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission really had it as a goal to try to establish and heal relationships. The TRC, people came together, and the elements of most TRC gatherings had people coming and there was a sharing circle where people would talk about what happened. People talked about their story, sometimes in private with just the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation commissioners would sit and listen to their story, and they would talk about what happened to them. Their stories are a gift Unless you listen with your heart and feel, you won't have the emotional energy to actually change. You need to listen to the damage that was caused. It's the only way that you find, you don't just listen, you have to feel. You got to embrace the pain that you've caused. Unless you do that, you won't develop the emotional resources necessary to actually change, to actually change. That's kind of part of listening. So the good thing about the TRC is they recorded lots of those stories that happened, lots of those stories that happened. And you can listen to them, and you need to listen to them so that it never happens again. The two of the things that the Truth and TRC asked people to, they thought it could lead to reconciliation. The two items that needed to be taught in Canada, in Canadian schools, but also to teach to public servants in Canada, people who serve the public, Canadian government. They needed to understand the history of the residential schools and what happened, and Indigenous history in general, so that it was more balanced than the one that was given to most people. And the second thing is that they needed to be educated about treaty. In the TRC, the Indigenous people thought those two things were key. They need to understand treaty and they need to understand the history of the residential schools. And the only way you understand those things is to have the story told. When Member of Parliament for Scarborough, John McKay, I think, not Peter McKay, but John McKay's Liberal, good guy. He got some residential schools. So at that time, the Liberal government, the split was, I think, 70% the government was going to take in the damages awarded through the residential school settlement. The church was going to have to shoulder 30%. I think it was a 70-30 split. John McKay and others were saying that the government should take all of that, not try to offload on the church. And but what he did is we were able, through John McKay, to have residential school survivors tell their story to the Liberal Social Caucus in government. And what that did is it put a face to that issue. Because for most Canadians, when they hear about residential school missing and murdered Indigenous women, they don't have a face. They just have this issue. But when they hear the story and they can have a face, then it's not just 100,000 kids in foster care or 100,000 people who went to residential school. Then you know that, Clifford George went to residential school, and Ray Jones went to residential school, and all these people went to residential school. And it was Pamela George that was murdered in Regina. And I know her cousins, and I know her relatives. And then it's not just a faceless issue. It's a name. That's why you need to listen. You need to listen. And you need to take responsibility and stop arguing about who's to blame. In Canada, I used to get all these emails from different people, and lots of times church people. And they would say, what's all this talk about residential school? My denomination wasn't involved in residential school. And I said, your prime minister admitted that Canada as a nation was guilty of forcing children into the residential school. And I said, so you're guilty. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to argue about it. You can just embrace it. You're guilty. Now move on to the next step. Take responsibility. Begin to work to heal. A contrite turning from sin. That's what repentance is. The 94 calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Begin to implement those. For Canadians, it's repentance is taking responsibility. Turn to heal the relationship with the land. turn to heal the relationship with the land by giving the land back to and pushing government to settle the land claims by signing treaties. Right now, they're in Canada, the political will to make treaty, they don't do it because they don't need to. They know it doesn't matter because there's only a few groups and a few academics who are putting pressure. As a whole, Canadian society needs to put pressure on politicians to settle land claims and to give land back that was wrongly taken. When we say that phrase, we are meeting today on the unceded land of the unceded traditional ancestral territory, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Coastal Salish. What we're saying is we're living on stolen land. We need to give that land back. Old Testament scholar in a book called The Land, used to teach at Regent. I can't remember his name. He said, the biblical idea of justice is to give things back that were wrongfully taken, to give things back. But the problem is sometimes other people have had people's things for so long, they believe that they're theirs, and they're not. Heal the land. Relationship with others by turning to heal the treaty relation. It's a nation-to-nation relationship and all that that means. It's a shift to heal the relationship with Canada needs to shift, and Canadian churches in particular need to shift away from triumphalism and embrace failures as part of their identity. In this way, they could walk in humility and respect. For the Academy in general, I wanted to talk about the Academy because I only got 7 minutes before I've used up my 50 minutes. You need to create, for the Academy, you need to create space for Indigenous thought. We do that by recognizing that Indigenous ways of knowing and being are different than the dominant Euro-Western ways of knowing and being. That means it's not just about curriculum. It's not just about curriculum. One of the mistakes that schools often make, universities sometimes, not all of them, but many of them continue to make, is thinking that it's just about the curriculum. We can change the curriculum and then it'll all be okay. The way that you change is by engagement. You got to enter into relationship with Indigenous people. That's how you create space. You got to acknowledge that it's different. Yeah, it's about relationship with Indigenous people and communities. It means you need to rethink the hegemony that the Academy embraces all the time, because the Academy likes to flatten everything out to make it sound like the Western postulate. Heard an African scholar put it this way. The West says, in order to be truly scientific, you have to talk as we do, for only we are truly scientific and objective. So you got to think in other ways to communicate and have dialogue. Also need to embrace Indigenous boundaries as a way of creating space for dreaming. When you're meeting with Indigenous people, when you go to meet with Indigenous people, when I go to teach in Indigenous communities, everybody shows up. Everybody shows up. The mushums, the grandpas, they show up, and the cookums, they show up, and all the kids show up. It's not just the people in the class, everybody shows up. And you've got grandkids coming in and leaving and coming back, and this is the community. You got to embrace it. You got to embrace it and learn to speak so that all can find hope in what you're saying. One of the problems that J.R. Miller identifies with the Academy is more and more of the Academy just talks this specialized language to a select few. We're saying good things in the university, but no one can understand what we're saying because we use this special jargon that the general society don't understand and don't find much use in. So we need to learn to speak in a way that, well, let me put it this way. A good leader listens to all the people, and then they speak at the end, and they put what's been said into a consensus a consensus, a statement in which everyone can go with. Now, maybe not everybody agrees with it, but everybody can live with this statement and they find hope that the dialogue that has been created is creating a journey, a way to go forward as a community. The university needs to think and to have a way to create space to dream. We need to create space for the other by entering into Indigenous communal relationship. I'm getting all these from an essay by Vine Deloria. I think it was useful. He said 3 things. You need to acknowledge that Indigenous ways of doing and being are different. You need to embrace Indigenous boundaries. And the boundaries for Indigenous people is the whole community. The university has focused so much, Western education focused so much on the exceptional individual, it throws the community out and just focuses on the exceptional individual. We need to focus on the community. It's the community. Individuals come, but they don't want to sever their relationship with their community, because then you're just like the people who ran residential schools, the programs, the policy that ran those things. You need to focus on developing capacity in the community. Lots of universities are doing good things, but I just wanted to say that. But you also need to embrace Indigenous communal identity. Part of that is that statement. That's part of embracing Indigenous communal identity, that acknowledgement of whose territory you're sitting upon. And it makes room for the other. Part of the historic treaty process that happened in Canada grew out of Indigenous people. It's not that we never had war, but we realized that the solution to sharing space is not to build bigger walls and bigger armies. The solution is to make treaty. A treaty tries to affirm that everyone has the right to a peaceful existence. A treaty tries to affirm that everybody should have access to live on the land. The treaty affirms that everyone should be able to have enough to eat, to be fed by Mother Earth. And the treaty affirms that the space between us, this space between us, is called harmony and respect. And this is the space for collaboration. For Indigenous people, in making the treaty, understood that their identity would change because of their relationship, but that together we could live in a good way so that we each became who we were created to be. The other was not an enemy. It was part of who we were becoming. The university needs to continue to do that, to be an exemplar for society, for the common good of society. And as we do that, I think we develop that 3rd step, a shared plan, because that's where we are in Canada. We've been doing some telling the truth since at least the 70s. We have been listening, trying to listen and creating opportunities, and the university can continue to create those dialogues where people could hear the truth and really listen. And then we need to come up with a shared plan, a dialogue, where we could come up with a shared plan. Because as individuals on the local level and communities come together to begin to heal, and there's been some good stuff that's happened, and that's the only way that government changes. Government's never, the only power that government has is the power of coercion. And the only thing they can really do as far as resources is to reallocate existing resources. But we can change on a local level as we work towards reconciliation. Then I think we can gain momentum and we will see the land healed. At least that's my hope. There you go, 50 minutes. Done.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Well done, Ray. Well, you shared a lot in 50 minutes, and thank you so much. This is excellent material to discuss. And so I'll open it up to people from the audience and the questions they might have. I noticed there's an anthropology professor there. He might have a good question. So I guess you've begun to talk about this, but I'll just sort of get the question started. The idea of moving someone from the position where they feel, I don't know if the right word is victim. You talked about developing support groups for people who are victims of abuse, but how to move people from the mentality of being a victim towards, you've begun to talk about that, but towards healing and towards a stronger identity. Do you have anything?
Yeah. Well, being a victim is one sort of step along the way. I mean,
Okay.
I think
Okay.
one of the things that now it came to me. So I was teaching this family life. I was supposed to do a family camp. So a bunch of families, we went camping together in a little Indigenous church in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And they wanted me to be the speaker who would talk about sort of family values. So what I did is I found this survey that they did in the 70s of the six values that all strong families have. And I was turned that into 6 talks. But in the first talk, I'm sitting there and I'm talking about telling these people how they could have a stronger family. And I look out and there's a woman there. Now she's married, but her husband, she's really been there because I think her husband was in and out of jail a little bit. She'd raised 6 kids, and I knew 2 of them were older teenagers. And she knew all of this stuff. And I'm thinking, I'm the wrong person's teaching the class here. She should be teaching the class. She knows more about how to kind of get through this and develop strength. And I guess part of what we do is just help people to see that because that's what education is, right? To draw out what is within and to help people see that they really do have everybody's done something right to get to this point. I think part of the secret to life is just do more of the stuff that builds up and less of the stuff that tears down, and we'll probably be okay. So, but what I found was, now this was just for me teaching as an Indigenous theologian. I found that most Indigenous people already knew the language of recovery. That's why I like Gabor Mate. I like the whole recovery field, because everybody knows that language. You can't get a program. You can't get help through social services. You can't get out of jail earlier if you ended up in jail. You can't. And I just found that, including me, everybody knew recovery language. So that was a language everybody used. So I tried to use that language. I always try to use in a community language that everybody knows instead of trying to teach them new jargon, and draw forth what is best. So then, but being a victim it's one step along the way. The recognition that you are a victim is part of healing. So at least something's gone sideways.
Right.
And then helping people to embrace the pool of pain and begin to deal with the distortions that we've developed in our lives. So we help people to deal with the distortions that they have by, a lot of it is just sitting in a group and continually reflecting back what we hear and then reminding people that they are significant. And because I'm a Christian, I would say stuff like, that Jesus loves you and he likes you and he likes you. And that, because I want people to feel it. I want people to feel it. And sometimes the only way you feel it is for a group of people to just tell you, that you're special. You're special. So that's what we do. Tell the truth.
Yeah.
And then help. Go ahead.
Jayant, did you have a question?
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really awesome. I just had a quick question. You mentioned about giving the land back to Indigenous people. And I was just wondering, how is it, because you mentioned when the land was taken away, it kind of broke down any societal structure of Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Giving the land back, how might it actually help build the society, Indigenous society back, especially if there's already been so much trauma?
I think that the examples that I have are, so how it's happening in Vancouver now. If there's a Musqueam person present, they could maybe they would be able to talk. So how it works is, like that golf course by the university, that went back to the Musqueam people, and then they have developed the skill to, they're going to build some condos at some point. Or maybe I'm not supposed to say that. Maybe people like their golf course. So anyways, at some point there's going to be some condos, and then the way they set it up for they're the strata, so they'll always own those things. So they're the strata. I think that's the process. So yes, you always have to give, you always have to, it's got to be, you always have to also teach the skill needed to use and develop the territory. So most groups, that's the approach that they, at least since the 70s, they developed the skill. They sent their young people to get the skill, to get engineering degrees, science degrees, so that they have the ability to manage the territory when it comes back. So then in 1999, when the Niska signed their treaty, they basically settled for what they'd asked for 100 years. It took BC stonewalled them for 100 years, and then they basically got what they'd asked for. They understand treaty. And then and in the problem in British Columbia, particularly for British Columbia, so that most of the other treaties, like especially the numbered treaties across the prairies, for every family unit of 5, it was 360 acres, then 160 acres. In British Columbia, they said it was only 10 acres, 10 to 15 acres per family. That's all BC. And the rationale BC used was because they haven't really done anything with the land. So, that terra nullius argument that was used in Australia. So giving the land back is sort of like happened in the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en Treaty. They acknowledge this territory, it belongs to us. And then you have to do, what does consent mean like if there's going to be development? Most groups, including like in Saskatchewan, I know that they were pushing for a different cost sharing. The way that when Canada made treaty, their understanding was they didn't have the money to buy the land. So what they would do is they would move settlers in, charge settlers taxes, and use some of that money to pay Indigenous people for the use of their territory. So that's still the system that's supposed to be in place, but most Canadians aren't aware of that. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Right. I wonder if Susan Wade had a question. Okay, somebody else?
You're muted.
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me now?
There you
Yep.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you may have answered that question already, Ray. I had 2 questions. One, could you elaborate on the concept of treaty as a remedy, as a help? And are there analogies to sort of God's covenants or God's treaties in the Old Testament to what you're talking about?
Yeah. There's a great article by J.R. Miller, maybe you've read it, called it's called Compact, Contract, Covenant, and it traced the development of the idea of treaty. And well, one of his things is that in Canada, even though Europeans were familiar with treaty, they did not introduce the idea of treaty to Indigenous people. That idea already existed in Canada and in New Zealand as well. So New Zealand also is a treaty nation. They have a treaty. That's how it's the foundation of their relationship. By the time the numbered treaties came along, treaties 1 through 11, primarily Ontario, Northern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and part of British Columbia, because the groups in northeastern British Columbia adhered to Treaty 8. And but the idea was that when you made treaty, the Lakota and the Dakota particularly have a making relative ceremony. So when they were making these treaties, they took part in Indigenous ceremonies, like in the signing of Treaty 6. The Treaty Commissioner, he writes in his journal that there was, I don't know how many different Indigenous people came singing. They were singing this song and with drums, and they were coming with horses and people towards the place where they were going to meet. And then they offered the pipe. And then the treaty commissioner and everybody who was with him took the pipe. They accepted the pipe. One of the other ceremonies that they did in Treaty 4, for example, was they did a sweetgrass ceremony, a making relative ceremony, it's called. And there's a braid of sweetgrass. One strand of the braid represents the newcomers. One strand represents the First Nations, and one strand represents the Creator. And when we made treaty, we promised to live like relatives. And what made it a covenant was the presence of the Creator, who promised that he would hold us to our word. And even in the words of the treaty commissioner, because I think he was sincere, Henry Morris, he said to the Indigenous people, he said, "We are making a covenant today." That was his words, and all the Indigenous people agreed. Yes, we are. He said, "This covenant will last as long as the rivers run, as long as the grass grows, as long as the sun shines." And Henry Morris goes on to say, "We are not like the Americans, who are only making a 20-year or a 25-year treaty. We are making this covenant for all time. For all time." That was the words of the treaty commissioner. And all the Indigenous people said, yes. And what also made it a covenant was they took part in these Indigenous ceremonies, but the Indigenous people also asked for a priest to come to do service with them on, the Lord's Day, on Sunday. So Henry Morris writes that about 200 individuals took part in a service that a minister did with the Indigenous people. For the Dakota of the Stoning Dakota, they even enlisted the help of the missionary. He was a Presbyterian. What was his name? McDougall. They enlisted his help to get certain groups from Alberta to come to the treaty. For this reason, I always say that the church were like guarantors to the treaty. So the church in Canada, too, is wrapped up into the treaty. It's not just this civil ceremony. It's the church itself is wrapped up in the treaty as well. So, and many Indigenous people, by the point that some treaties were written, had already embraced Christian faith. One of the difficulties at the residential school, she's passed on now, but one residential school survivor, she said, when they were made to go to residential school, her and some of her Anglican friends, there was 3 of them, little girls, they'd say their Anglican prayers every day in the morning and the evening at the residential school by themselves. She said, I remember her saying, "If it wasn't for Jesus, I never would have made it through the residential school," she said. And I thought, man, that's priceless. That's priceless. What a statement. If it wasn't for Jesus, I never would have made it through the residential schools. So that's the irony of the residential school and of the church in Canada. So, and that's why Indigenous people keep asking for, because of the treaty is why they keep asking for reconciliation. Another thing that Canadians don't understand is that it was Indigenous people who asked for reconciliation. It was Indigenous people who paid for the TRC out of their settlement for the residential schools. And yet politicians always forget and always want to take the credit. Indigenous people are the most forgiving people in Canada. They continue to forgive and ask for reconciliation. And I've been inspired by the opportunity to work with Indigenous folks. So anyways,
Good.
I kind of get going, sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. Are there other questions people have? You have a lot to share with us. I will throw in one. I just wonder, you and your wife have been involved in developing these groups, support groups for personal healing, and do you want to talk a little bit more about them? Those sound like
Sure.
very, very practical. I suspect you use some of the Gabor Mate recovery.
Yeah.
But
Well,
could you talk about that?
yeah. Well, if you were going to, I suppose a lot of it was just, it's, the thing we were using was just CBT, right? Cognitive brain therapy. Like, I suppose you could classify it as that. And we were using stuff by, there's probably better stuff. It was a model called the 4-stage 3 shift. 4-stage 3 shift. And it was developed by some Christian psychologists, Dan Allender and Larry Crabb, and we were using this stuff because you needed a model, some kind of model. And then we went to this training program in Muskegon, Michigan, and it was called the Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training. Now it was all based on the encounter group movement that came out of the 70s. There was different encounter group movements. Marriage Encounter by the Catholic Church, which my wife and I went to, which actually was a good program. But what we found is the reason that we used this program was the way that I began to evaluate different programs was, does it speak to the heart? So is the first movement on an emotive level? Because if it was primarily cognitive, you couldn't get buy-in from Indigenous people, because that's not how it's not that there's no cognitive, but Indigenous people believed, and this is what the elders, they thought emotions was a valid way of knowing. You just needed to understand how to interpret it. And the elders were the ones that helped you understand how you came to know things by emotion. So the program had to begin at an emotive level. And then it also fit with the Anishinaabe way of teaching from the end back to the beginning. So then you begin with the emotions, because that's where most people are. And then you begin to unwrap things. You're moving back. And so then we called it Inanamoan. So we went to the Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training, which was good training. Most of the Indigenous people who went to it, though, it was a negative experience, because I don't know if it was because they were Americans, and Americans, even when they think they're being subtle, aren't. And the Indigenous people just, like, these guys were so in your face. So we indigenized this thing. We got permission. We indigenized this thing, and it took a few ways that we indigenized it. One was we styled the whole thing. We looked for a different defining metaphor than Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training. We called it Inanamoan, which is an Oji Cree word. It means the feelings that you have in our heart. So the idea was, let's come away and talk about the feelings that we have in our heart. What's really going on? What's really going on? The Blackfoot, when we did it with the Blackfoot, so we did some later on, we did some with the Blackfoot. They didn't want a Cree name. It's pretty hard to sell a program in the Blackfoot territory with a Cree name, because they're traditional enemies. So they used a name that means telling the true story. And the idea was that you would learn to lead a small group by being in a small group. So you just have a plenary session, then you break into a small group. And then you would just move through this process of realizing all the distortions, where the distortions were. The things that were supposed to be coping mechanisms had become our way of life. You go numb. That's a coping mechanism to help you get through an extremely traumatic event. And it's helpful that way. But for many Indigenous people, that became our whole way of existence. We were numb all the time. And in these small groups, we created these so we could begin to talk about what was going on, so that we could begin to feel and move out of the numbness. And then we always had trained counselors. At the beginning, we went over the participants with the duty to report, like if they disclosed that they had been abusive to anybody, we were going to have to tell the appropriate authorities. If they became suicidal, we would have to tell the appropriate. We wanted to be upfront with people. So we also had 2 licensed counselors with us when we did these, because sometimes people would be triggered and you needed to have, you know, someplace that they could talk to. So we did all those things. But we didn't focus on going into all the gory details, but rather our focus was just what had happened. What were the lies that I believed about myself? And how are these distorting how I'm seeing things? And then repentance we defined as, what would it be like if? What would it be like if I loved with my whole heart? If I loved with everything that I had? What if I just let down my need to be protective because I've been hurt so often? What would it be like if I loved with everything I had? For us, this was a vision, trying to get a vision in a safe place that you could maybe begin to even dream about it. And we thought this might help people develop, embrace who they were, but also begin to see that life was coming out of them. Life was coming out of them. We styled it after. We had 2 dominant metaphors that I used to describe it. One was, I borrowed one from Henry Nouwen, the Eucharist in the life of the beloved. So just like Christ was taken, blessed, broken, and given, so we're taken, blessed, broken, and given. And we've been broken, but life is still coming out of us, and we were wounded healers. I was doing that because it seemed as if society was telling Indigenous people that they were a problem to be solved. And we were trying to say that even though all this stuff has happened, life is still coming out of you. You still have all of this to offer because of who you are, just because of who you are. If we could begin to learn to feel again. And then the second last session, or the third last session, that's when we say, okay, here's the psychological model we've been using, and we describe it. A friend of mine who's a counselor, and she's also survived she was abducted as an Indigenous woman, and she survived, and she's the one who gives this. Her name's Linda Martin, and she's a Muskrat Dam in Ontario. And she just paints this picture, and all the Indigenous people at this point usually go, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, that's what we're doing. And that's the pattern we follow with the small group. What's interesting is those non-Indigenous ministers and engineers and counselors just have a difficult time figuring it out. Even when you say, okay, this is what we're doing, they go, oh, I can't get it. There's too much mystery there. But Indigenous people, they go, oh yeah, it makes sense. So I always laugh. At that point, I always laugh. And so that's what we're doing. And then we're trying to create these groups so that also we're trying to create a group because that way it doesn't require us to continue to pour some outside resource into to make, we want it to be sustainable. We want it to be sustainable. So that was the thing we were doing.
Excellent. That was very helpful. Thank you.
And then I morphed it into another thing called the teaching house that moves around. And then we did some community-based stuff. We continue to do some community-based stuff where we just bring together Indigenous identity, theological education, and some aspect of healing. And we go into the community before and we just say, hey, if we could bring these 3 things together over 4 days, what would it look like? What do you think would be cool? And they say, oh, everybody says, well, this would be cool. I said, all right, let's do it. So we set it up, we go do it. And then we come back a little while later and say, hey, how did it go? Any way we could help? And then so that was the idea.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Are there other questions for Ray? Just speak up. I guess you have to mute your microphone.
Is any of that work, Dr. Aldred, going on in urban settings like Vancouver?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, though, you're right. Well, I don't know if this is what you're thinking, but urban urban is tough because there's so much stuff. It's pretty hard to compete with. It's pretty hard to compete with the city because there's so much other stuff going on. Like when we go into, like if I go to the Paw, Manitoba, like there's, it's get a big crowd, because it's not lots to do in the Paw, Manitoba. It's not like there's nothing to do, but Vancouver, though, there's always tens. So we haven't done as much, although we did one in Nanaimo and we focused on just leaders and we got people out for a week. And so we did some, but we had people from across Canada come to that. So,
And who is we?
who's we?
Mhm.
Oh, that was, who put that on? Well, Vancouver School of Theology.
Mm.
And then I partnered with, we brought in Patricia Vickers, Dr. Patricia Vickers, who's, I think she's in Haida Gwaii right now, last time I heard.
Mm.
But now, so we were doing CBT and it works, but it doesn't work for everybody. Cognitive brain, stuff doesn't work for anybody. I think the latest thing that's quite helpful is somatic therapy, and she's really good at it.
Mhm.
Although I think what we add is we can talk about Christian faith because most Indigenous folks, Christian faith is always right there. It's part of their language. So this is one of the problems with the academy and with secular society, and maybe because they have rules, they can't talk about it. But when that's the language game of the people, you're sort of hamstringing yourself if you can't even use that language. And I'm not talking about using in a pejorative sense, which the university does quite well, striking down, showing the, ridiculing Christian faith and things. And so that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, but just framing what you're trying to teach within that context. Like one of the things that we tried to do, I always try to bring in counselors, local counselors and local like NADAP workers, because I wanted people to see that counseling can fit within church theology. They're not opposites or anything. I wanted to raise awareness of local resources that people had for healing that maybe they just weren't accessing. So I talked with First United in Vancouver about doing something, but they have lots of good programs. Everybody's doing different programs and they're all kind of like similar to this. So I don't know if that helps, Joyce.
Well, I'll try to find you.
All right. Cool.
Thanks, Joyce. Any other questions? I know there are a number of you there. Probably have on the edge of your seat to ask a question. Got a few more minutes. Oh, I was gonna, if nobody else is, I was gonna ask how the interface is with the students you're developing at Vancouver School of Theology and this broader work. How are you shaping these theology students to carry on your legacy, I guess?
Well, what I do is some of the senior students, I try to take them with me to when I do the teaching house. So then if they're interested, so there was a young woman who was doing her THM and she was interested in this. So I said, well, why don't you come with me? You come with me to the teaching house event, which was also Inanimo, and we were using that format. I said, why don't you come with me? You can just be a participant and an observer the first time. And then the second time you come with me, you'll teach a seminar. You could teach a seminar. So she did the second time she came with, and then the third time she taught a longer seminar. And then I was her advisor on her thesis, and she put this project as part of her thesis and wrote it up. And so, yeah, that's kind of, because I'm old now. So my whole idea is that if I teach people, and put them forward. So even in this, when we're training, we always took a team of 6 when we were doing these community training. So 2 of them were local people from that community. Or no, yeah, 2, and we had 4 of us, Elaine and I and Rick and Linda Martin, and that would be the team, and we would go in, and then we would also bring along local people who had experienced the training before, and we would get them to give part of their story. So we would work them into one of the plenary sessions, and then we would also involve them in all the leadership meetings, and that way you learn by shadowing the leaders, and you just develop, you learn by doing, which is kind of the only way I learn. I don't learn very well just without actually taking part. Like right now, my wife's training me to bead, and she tries to tell me and I just don't get it, but when she shows me, I get it. So
Very
So
good.
it's Heather.
yeah.
And thank you so much, Ray. Oh, it's so wonderful to see your face and hear you again. A bit to follow up from Joyce's observation about maybe the challenges of doing this kind of thing in an urban setting in Vancouver. And you mentioned First United. We're kind of in, as you probably know, I chair the board of directors now down there, and we're in a big redevelopment project. But with Cheryl Bear as our director of community ministry, I think once we get sorted through some of this transition period and our redevelopment in partnership with Luminative Housing, that there could be some great opportunities to partner on holding some of your
Good.
Yeah, your House That Moves.
Yeah. So the key thing to this is that, well, I don't know, I thought it was key. You have to learn how to tell your story. And you see what happens is, so you tell your story slowly. Part of the triumphalism that exists in Western society is they tell their story really fast. It can only last 2 hours and there has to be a happy ending. Or if you're French, then it has to be a tragic ending, depending, but you just 2 hours, that's it. What we develop is this skill at just telling the story really quickly. Most of our stories work out, but we tell them slowly over a week so that people can feel. So what you want to model is that you can still feel this. When you're telling your story, you can still feel that pain, but you have some healing. So the idea is that you want to meet people where they're at, and maybe because you're meeting them there, they have the courage to begin to feel and walk along with you. Maybe that's the idea, but you're trying to do it in a very controlled way because you're not trying to trigger people. You're not trying to talk about all the gory details, but just focus on the distortions, the feelings, and maybe the lies that you believed about yourself, and then see that there's hope and there's strength because you've made it this far. That's kind of how I think about it. So, and I just found that how I learned that was from Indigenous elders who they understood how this. I used to sit and tell them, I just talked to them, and then all of a sudden they would just say to me, I know you're struggling with this thing, but it'll be okay. Just hang in there. And I'm going, I haven't even talked about that thing, and yet somehow they just would understand. So that's what we're trying to do. So
That's
thanks,
great.
Heather.
I wonder, is there one final question for Ray before we wrap up?
I have a question, if that's all right.
Sure.
Hi, Ray. Thanks so much for sharing with us today. My question is, so I work in a church community, and you were saying church can embrace failure as part of our story, and we have a hard time doing that. Is there some advice you can give towards helping church communities embrace their kind of failure as part of our story, Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it makes sense in that. So this is how I think about it. So I get it from two. I actually get that idea from two sources. One is Paul Ricoeur in a little essay called there's a book of essays on sacred something sacred. Anyways, he talks about society in attempting. Society needed to move away from nationalism because nationalism was causing a lot of problems. He was saying that you need to move away from triumphalism. The church needed to let go of triumphalism, and it's, yes, we understand that the creator is moving all things towards harmony, but you can't force that on people because that's imperialism. So you just got to let go of triumphalism. And the other is Catherine Tanner, and she says that the church for Christian identity, you need to embrace failure as part of your identity. And I think the way that we do that is through one of the ways that it happened was an example is apology. And Henry Nouwen says the same thing. A priest or a church leader, you build community not through doing everything right, but through confession and forgiveness. You gotta get good at saying, I'm sorry. I am sorry. I've been married for 42 years. And when you're young, as a young man, you try to do everything right, thinking that'll make your spouse feel like she's, happy. It just makes her feel like she's not needed, or he's not needed, or your partner feels like they're not needed because you can do everything for yourself. It's only when we place the weight of our trust and we become dependent upon one another that communities developed. So for the church, when it comes to reconciliation, take a lesson from the book of Job. God says to Job's friends, you have spoken wrongly about me. You need to, and he strikes them with leprosy. And he says, you need to go to my servant Job and get him to pray for you. I think in Canada, the church, I always say to priests, you don't get to pronounce the absolvement. You don't get to do that this time. You don't get to be in charge of reconciliation. You can only respond. You got to learn to respond. That's how you let go of triumphalism and embrace failure. When you've done things wrong with your kids, you got to go to them. I missed my daughter's grad because I thought going to work was more important. And later on, I had to go back to her and I say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I've done it like she said, Dad, you've told me that 3 times. It's okay. It's okay. But that's part of my failure as a dad. I'm a workaholic and I just blew it that time. And then you got to be open to when they show up and they're mad because, you did it. Because when people start to get a hold of what happened, that's kind of, the church is okay with saying I'm sorry until those people that you offended show up and start, and let me tell you how much you hurt. That's the hard part. So sitting there, listening and feeling, that's the difficult part. But that's the part that brings healing. So thanks for your question, Aaron.
Great, Aaron. Well, we'll wrap it up there, and it's a very good point to finish on. And thank you so much, Ray, for leading us in a very thoughtful, profound, kind of healing discussion. And thanks for the trajectory and the passion with which you've shared these things. And I'm sure people will want to follow up and see how they can be involved in these very things, be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and build towards healing and
you're welcome.
Reconciliation. Okay.
Hey, and one thing, can I brag up my background here is just a picture that my daughter did.
Sure.
So